The closest ally is turning away from Putin? Has China really started to intercept Belarus? After talks with the dictator, Lukashenko unexpectedly flew to Beijing, and Xi Jinping's statements immediately sparked a wave of speculation. Minsk is seeking new support while Moscow increases the pressure. Why did China suddenly start talking about Belarus's sovereignty? But that's not all. Putin revealed for the first time what he discussed with Lukashenko for over a day. The details are shocking. An unexpected turn of events? Why did these explanations only add fuel to the fire? I'll tell you in a moment. Hello, this is Ukraine Today. I'm Solomia Dolik with the latest events. Is China saving Lukashenko from Putin? In political circles, it's increasingly said that an invisible struggle for influence over Belarus may be unfolding between Moscow and Beijing. Against this backdrop, Alexander Lukashenko's unexpected diplomatic route has drawn attention. After the Belarusian dictator spent over 3 days in Moscow, he almost immediately flew to China for talks with Xi Jinping. And this sparked a new wave of speculation regarding the true purpose of his visit. According to some analysts, the Kremlin continues to pressure Minsk, trying to achieve deeper involvement of Belarus in the war against Ukraine. At the same time, Lukashenko himself seems to be trying to avoid such a scenario and is seeking additional support from Beijing. The economic aspect is no less important. Belarus remains critically dependent on the Russian economy, but is experiencing serious financial difficulties, a labor shortage, and slowing growth. That's why, according to experts, Lukashenko could have asked China for new investments and financial support to reduce dependence on the Kremlin. Lukashenko's own words after the meeting with Xi Jinping drew particular attention.
We are constantly exchanging views with you regarding the international agenda and the situation in the region. I am constantly informing you about this.
In response, the Chinese leader emphasized,
China and Belarus are ironclad friends. Belarusian-Chinese relations are experiencing an historical peak.
According to a number of observers, Lukashenko's trip to China may indicate not only a search for money, but also an attempt to gain political support. And as we can see, the trip was not for nothing. China stood up for Lukashenko. Xi Jinping promised to protect the sovereignty of Belarus. A loud statement from Beijing. During the meeting with Alexander Lukashenko, the leader of China stated that China supports the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Belarus. This is reported by the Wall Street Journal. According to the publication, Xi Jinping's statement came at a time when Minsk found itself under pressure from several directions at once, both due to Russia's war against Ukraine and due to complex relations with the Kremlin. Political observers are already calling the signals from Beijing a demonstration that China is interested in maintaining stability in Belarus and isn't hiding its influence on one of Moscow's closest allies. At the same time, Beijing hasn't officially declared any intention to interfere in the relationship between Minsk and the Kremlin. And then new shocking details of the meeting emerge. Putin revealed details of the multi-day negotiations with Lukashenko. They supposedly didn't reach any agreements regarding the war with Ukraine. In an interview with a Russian propagandist, Putin stated that the main topic of the negotiations was the economy.
We talked for 24 hours, maybe even more, in an informal setting. It was a very successful and meaningful trip.
Separately, the head of the Kremlin commented on the Ukrainian side's statement regarding possible risks from Belarus.
Harsh shouts from the Ukrainian side don't cause any panic for Lukashenko. He approaches everything very calmly and in a balanced way.
As a reminder, Lukashenko arrived in Russia late last week and spent more than 24 hours with Putin. Against this backdrop, various assumptions continue to emerge regarding the true nature of the talks, specifically about Belarus's possible involvement in the war. At the same time, Putin assures that this specific issue was not discussed in detail. And while the Kremlin talks about friendship without borders, China is already openly discussing the future of Russian territories. Moscow is rapidly losing its independence. And in China, they're already talking about scenarios that could shock the Kremlin. Russia has fallen into the trap of its own ally. Why do these statements cause a nervous reaction in the Kremlin? We'll tell you more. China is devouring Russia. Quietly, without unnecessary words. Xi Jinping is taking territories and Putin gladly gives them away, bowing at his feet. Beijing is turning the Far East and Siberia into a raw material appendage with a long-term Chinese contract. A clear example is the Zashulanskoye coal deposit in Transbaikalia, developed jointly by the Russian OMPLUS Group and the Chinese Shenhua Group. The project is designed for a century of extraction, and the Russian side is also generously handing out tax breaks. In fact, it looks like a long-term lease of the region in exchange for investment, with Beijing as the main beneficiary. Starting in 2027, they plan to send about 5 million tons of coal to China from here annually. That's hundreds of trucks every day. New routes are being laid literally through forests near mineral water sources and nature conservation zones. Ecology, it seems, is a secondary detail in this system that simply wasn't included in the business plan. Along with resources, China is actively entering the region through people and business. In the Baikal region, tourism infrastructure is growing to accommodate Chinese visitors. Investors are buying up land and building hotels, displacing local entrepreneurs. According to various estimates, up to 2 million citizens of the PRC may already be in the Far East. And against this backdrop, it looks less and less like a partnership and more like a gradual economic reformatting of the region to suit Beijing's interests.
And while Russia is gradually turning into a resource periphery for China, even more drastic scenarios are appearing in the Chinese information space. No longer about cooperation, but about the actual division of Russian territories in the event of a crisis. And surprisingly, this is presented not as a fantasy, but as a geopolitical calculation. An article appeared in the Chinese media directly discussing potential control over 7 million square kilometers of the Russian Far East in the event of an internal collapse of the Russian Federation. The authors point out that due to the war against Ukraine, Russian forces have been moved to the west, leaving the eastern regions virtually empty, with minimal military presence and weak control over the territory. The economic conclusion sounds even harsher. Russia, according to the authors, is rapidly degrading, and its economy is allegedly smaller than a single Chinese province. And here, cold logic comes into play. If the center of the Russian Federation weakens, the Far East and its resources must not go to waste. At the same time, the authors cautiously warn Beijing against direct military expansion, hinting at a scenario of international isolation similar to the situation surrounding Crimea. Instead, a different approach is proposed: a soft absorption through investment, long-term contracts, and support for friendly forces in the region that formally maintain independence but effectively become dependent on China. In fact, the text conveys the main idea without sugarcoating. Russia no longer seems capable of fully controlling its own eastern territories, and China, seizing the moment, can gradually fill this vacuum of influence. And even if all this is presented as analysis, the very appearance of such scenarios in the public sphere looks like a signal. Beijing is already thinking in terms of a post-Russia era.
The collapse of Russia is no joke. Only through careful preparation can we move forward calmly.
Or perhaps the Middle Kingdom will not wait for the Russian Federation to collapse, but will speak the language of force. China is building a giant military mega-complex in the desert, so massive that Western analysts are already saying outright they have never seen anything like it. This is a new strategic zone near intercontinental nuclear missile silos where, according to Reuters, over 80 launch pads, bunkers, a railway hub, airfields, and command centers are being built. Essentially a full-fledged military fortress of the future. Of particular concern are 3 giant octagonal complexes surrounded by fortifications and protected infrastructure. Experts suggest that electronic warfare systems, command centers, or elements of nuclear infrastructure, including the preparation and deployment of mobile missile systems, could be located there. But the key detail is that no one knows exactly what is inside. And it is this uncertainty that scares analysts the most. In fact, this is an unprecedented expansion of China's nuclear architecture against the backdrop of intensifying confrontation with the United States, especially around Taiwan. Not just a military base is rising in the desert, but a new level of strategic reality where Beijing demonstrates its readiness to play the long game. And while the world tries to grasp the scale of what it has seen, experts admit they have never recorded such a level of military construction in the era of nuclear states. For Putin, this is a real geopolitical cold shower. Russia looks less and less like an independent power center and more like a resource periphery in China's orbit. The Celestial Empire isn't acting abruptly for now, but it seems Putin might see the day when Xi Jinping takes what's his suddenly and without warning.
There hasn't been such a sharp turnaround in a long time. So what happened? Why have Lukashenko and his inner circle suddenly started nervously distancing themselves from events they were openly linked to until recently? And doesn't this mean that Minsk received a signal that forced the Belarusian authorities to seriously think about their own future? All the details are in the following report.
In Minsk, they're hitting the panic button as hard as they can. Lukashenko, who for years tried to look like a formidable Kremlin ally and regularly threatened neighbors with all possible punishments, has gone suspiciously quiet in recent days. After Volodymyr Zelensky's tough statements regarding Belarusian involvement in supporting Russian attacks from Belarusian territory, official Minsk unexpectedly switched to a mode of cautious excuses and demonstrative peacefulness. It's particularly interesting how the Belarusian authorities suddenly started emphasizing that they are not taking part in the war. The first signal was a strange story involving a statement by Sergei Lavrov. Belarusian state media unexpectedly cut the loudest part of his quote about how those who try to drag Belarus into the war will regret it. Only a convenient phrase remained about Minsk supposedly not taking part in the conflict. It looks as if those in Belarusian offices suddenly decided that bellicose rhetoric might now bring more trouble than benefit. The second warning bell was Defense Minister Viktor Krenin. The same official who at the start of the full-scale invasion spoke about the lack of threats to Ukraine from Belarusian territory is now actively explaining that it makes no sense for Belarus to get involved in the war. Until recently, Minsk loved to show off missiles, drills, and fierce statements, but now the main message has become, we don't want to fight at all. It seems the rhetoric has changed so sharply that even the propagandists can't always keep up with the new party line. The third signal came from the Secretary of the Security Council of Belarus, Alexander Volfovich. He also suddenly started talking about the need to end the war as quickly as possible and about Minsk's desire to avoid any involvement in the conflict. And here a rather funny contrast arises. Just recently, Lukashenko, with a serious face, demonstrated nuclear ambitions and spoke about the readiness to respond to any challenges. And now, official Minsk increasingly resembles a person who was shouting loudly over a fence, then suddenly realized that the gates were left open. The problem for the Belarusian leadership is that statements alone can no longer fix the situation. After all, Ukraine and the West see the reality perfectly well. The Belarusian military-industrial complex works in the interests of the Russian war machine. Part of the logistics is provided through the country's territory, and the infrastructure is used to support Russian operations. Therefore, the current campaign about not wanting to fight looks more like an attempt to urgently distance themselves from possible consequences than a real change in policy. And while Lukashenko used to play the part of the Kremlin's most vocal ally, the situation looks quite different now. In Minsk, it seems they're realizing that the longer the war lasts, the higher the cost of even indirect support for Russia becomes. So, the Belarusian leadership now resembles a passenger who sat happily by the driver for years but is now nervously asking if it's time to get out. The only question is whether Minsk has started thinking about this far too late. And this is exactly why Minsk has suddenly started talking about peace and a reluctance to fight. Volodymyr Zelensky has publicly called Lukashenko to account for years of cautious involvement in the war for the Kremlin. And we're no longer talking about political statements or diplomatic gestures, but about very specific targets. Ukraine's president reported 4 Russian relay stations in the Gomel and Brest regions used to coordinate drone attacks on Ukrainian cities. According to Zelensky, these systems were used to attack the Zhytomyr, Rivne, and Volyn regions, as well as energy and rail infrastructure. In other words, while Minsk claimed neutrality, Russian drones were using Belarusian territory to target Ukraine more accurately. And now Kyiv is saying it straight, it's time to choose a side. Zelensky stressed that Ukraine has repeatedly shared information with Minsk through intelligence and other channels. Simply put, first there were warnings behind closed doors, then there were signals, and now the public face has begun. It was right after this that a campaign suddenly started in Belarus claiming they aren't in the war and don't want to be involved. The president was especially blunt, saying no one cares about Lukashenko's excuses anymore, as Kyiv now judges actions, not words. And those actions speak for themselves. Belarusian companies are working for the Russian military-industrial complex. Fuel is still being supplied to the Russian army, and infrastructure is being used for attacks on Ukrainian cities. Ukraine has effectively issued an ultimatum. Those relay stations must be dismantled. And either Belarus does it itself, or Ukraine will take care of the problem on its own. The message was as simple as it gets. It's either them or us. Judging by the nervous activity of Belarusian officials lately, Minsk knows this isn't just another diplomatic exchange of words. So it's possible that all this sudden talk of peace from Belarusian officials has a very simple explanation. After years of playing the game of we're not at war but we're helping, Lukashenko has been told directly for the first time the era of ambiguity is over. And now Minsk faces a choice that is becoming increasingly difficult to put off. Well, it seems the Kremlin is starting to lose even those allies they once considered completely reliable. Alexander Lukashenko is increasingly making statements that sound less like support for Putin and more like an attempt to distance himself from the war. While the Russian dictator continues to demand loyalty and new sacrifices from his allies for the sake of his ambitions, Minsk is increasingly showing a completely different mood, not to get involved, not to take risks, and at any cost not to end up in the same trench as the Kremlin. And the longer the war lasts, the stronger the impression that Lukashenko already sees what they prefer to keep quiet about in Moscow. This adventure is becoming more and more expensive, and the way out of it is becoming more and more difficult. More on this in our report. Next. Against the backdrop of a protracted war and the Kremlin's losses, cracks are beginning to appear within the Union bloc that are already difficult to hide with rhetoric about unity. Belarus is increasingly showing signs of distancing itself from a scenario where it is assigned the role of the next participant in the conflict. And Alexander Lukashenko's statements sound less and less like support for Moscow and more like an attempt to jump out of a rapidly overheating cauldron. A loud signal sounded in Grodno, where Lukashenko actually publicly outlined a line that Minsk is not going to cross. At a time when Russia continues an exhausting war, his words sounded like a demonstrative refusal to go in the direction of the Kremlin's expectations and as a political gesture that Moscow could hardly ignore.
Are we supposed to go and fight in Ukraine against our will? Do we want to be cannon fodder there? No, we don't want that.
The phrasing about cannon fodder sounds like an emotional breakdown of the diplomatic facade. This is no longer a careful balancing act. It is a direct demonstration of fear of being dragged into a war that is increasingly perceived as an exhausting and unpredictable meat grinder. And this is where the key nerve of Minsk is revealed, the desire to maintain the alliance with Russia but not to end up on the front line. No less indicative was the second part of his statement addressed to several neighboring countries at once. Lukashenko tried to assure Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania that Belarus does not seek escalation and does not plan to fight against them. But in the current context, such words sound not like confidence, but like an attempt to preemptively clear himself of suspicion of a possible expansion of the war.
I want the Poles, Lithuanians, and Ukrainians to hear me. We don't want to fight them.
Economist Alexander Kirsch expressed the opinion that Lukashenko seems to be winking with both eyes at once, as if to say, "Hey, whoever takes me, I'm yours forever." But at the same time, he sends signals to both Putin and the West.
To Putin, don't demand the impossible from us, you scoundrel. It's not 2022 anymore. So, you fool, come to your senses. To the West, maybe we shouldn't quarrel. We are smart people, especially me. We're negotiating with Trump little by little. And I want that with everyone. Why do you need this Chikanuskaya? It's not serious.
In essence, we are seeing the classic logic of survival of a weaker ally in the shadow of a protracted war. The longer Russia sinks into the conflict, the more obvious the risk of being dragged in without the ability to control the consequences becomes for Minsk. And today's rhetoric from Lukashenko no longer looks like support for an ally, but like an attempt to carefully but increasingly openly distance himself from him, while there is still room for maneuver. Moreover, Batka is increasingly making overtures to the West. During another speech in Grodno, Lukashenko stated that he is ready for negotiations with the West and called for a civilized dialogue in the interests of our peoples. He emphasized that Belarus is neither an aggressor nor an accomplice in the war and is trying to build an image of a state that stands aside from the conflict despite its alliance with Russia.
We have no intention of fighting anyone. We only seek friendship. We have no intention of going to war. We want to be peaceful people. We want to live in peace. We will do everything for the sake of peace because war is a catastrophe.
Against this background, more pragmatic assessments of the security situation are appearing. According to the spokesperson for the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine, no additional Russian units are currently being recorded on the territory of Belarus that would indicate the formation of a new strike group. At the same time, Russia, according to the Ukrainian side's estimates, continues to pressure Minsk with demands for deeper involvement in the war. Despite the absence of signs of direct preparation for an offensive, the risks of provocations and destabilization in the northern direction remain. Ukraine, for its part, continues to strengthen its defensive lines and fortify the border, understanding that even Minsk's neutral rhetoric does not guarantee full predictability of the situation. And this is exactly where the key question of this entire political construct arises. Is Lukashenko truly capable of gradually stepping out from under Putin's shadow, balancing between the fear of being drawn into the war and dependence on the Kremlin? Or is this just a temporary rhetorical attempt to buy time in a situation where the room for maneuver is narrowing every day? The answer to this question could determine not only the future of Belarus, but also whether it will become the next episode in the war it is currently trying to keep at a distance. And how do you feel about these events? Write your opinion in the comments. Like the video and stay informed about the main news. More to come. Well, we'll see you in the next report.